Everyone seems to be aware of the existence of the Mongol Tatar yoke. Everyone knows that as a result of a foreign invasion in 1237, for centuries Russia was bogged down in the darkness of poverty, ignorance, cruelty and violence, leading to economic and political dependence on its enslavers, the Mongol Khans and the rulers of the Golden Horde. The school history textbook clearly states it. The Mongol Tatar hordes were wild and nomadic tribes that did not have their own written language and culture. They invaded the territory of medieval Russia on horseback from the distant borders of China, conquered it, and subjected it to slavery for 300 years from the 13th to the 15th century. It is believed that the Mongol Tatar invasion brought incalculable troubles to the Russian people. It resulted in huge human losses, destruction and plunder of material and spiritual values, throwing the economic and cultural development of Russia 3 centuries back in comparison to Europe. Everyone knows about it now. However, was it truly so? American historian Eric Middlefort, working in European archives, uncovered unusual material. It turns out that a strange wave of insanity hit the European nobility in the 16th century. Moreover, it was indeed in the 16th century. Neither before nor after this era was anything like this observed. Middlefort wrote a book called Mad Princes of Renaissance Germany on this subject. How did the astonishing epidemic of insanity manifest itself? For example, Albert Frederick, Duke of Prussia, went mad in the following manner. He tore apart portraits of Martin Luther and went to bed in full battle gear, expecting that Prussia would be attacked by hordes of Mongols. Hordes of Mongols in Europe in the 16th century, 100 years after the end of the Mongol Tatar yoke in Russia? It looks like he has really gone mad. Modern historians believe that Europe was never conquered by the Mongols, that the forces of the invaders were depleted due to the heroic resistance of the Russian people. Thus Russia saved Europe from enslavement. Meanwhile, historians admit that in 1241, as a result of the so-called Western Campaign, the Mongols defeated the army of Henry II the Pious, Duke of Silesia, near Wrocław and invaded Poland, and then Hungary, Moravia, and Silesia. Europe tried to resist, but the unified troops under the command of King Bela IV of Hungary were defeated by Batu Khan. During 6 days of retreat, most of the troops were vanquished, and the Mongols captured the capital of Hungary, Pest. By 1242, the troops of Batu Khan had already reached the shore of the Adriatic Sea. Lev Gumilyov, in his book, Ancient Russia and the Great Steppe, provides the following evidence. Western Europe was in a state of panic. Fear gripped not only Germany, but also France, Burgundy, and Spain, and brought with it a complete stalling of England's trade with the continent. So who really were the Mongol hordes that so frightened Europe in the 16th century? As a real state, Mongolia emerged only in the 20th century and, even now, it is at a low level of development, including in terms of military art. Perhaps being a powerful empire in the past, it somehow degraded? There have been such examples in history. For example, the fall of the Babylonian and Roman empires, the savagery of Europe during the early Middle Ages, and so on. However, there is another perspective.
At present, neither ordinary Mongols nor their intellectuals are aware of such an extremely important event for their country as the conquest of Russia and Europe. They learned all of this data from external sources, including Western literature. If this had been such a historical event, then customs, culture, and writing would have remained in Mongolia. Currently, there is nothing of this in Mongolia. Their writing appeared in the 20th century. It didn't exist before.
The typical stereotype theory about the Mongol-Tatar yoke in Russia is not supported by domestic sources, yet it is still effectively taught in schools, often with reference to Russian medieval chronicles. But many historical documents have been preserved that contradict what is taught in schools nowadays. Here, for example, a medieval handwritten article list from the embassy of Tsar Boris Godunov to England in 1601–1602 gives a detailed account of the nobleman Grigory Mikulin and clerk Ivan Zinoviev. In particular, it contains a conversation between the Russian ambassador Grigory Mikulin and the Scottish ambassador in London. The ambassador asked Grigory, "How are the Tatars with your great sovereign now?" And Grigory said to the ambassador, "Which Tatars are you asking about? Many Buzurman kings and princes serve our great sovereign, His Royal Majesty. And many Tatars, people of the kingdoms of Kazan and Astrakhan and Siberia, and Cossack and Kalmyk hordes as well as many other hordes." As can be seen from the text, the Russian ambassador Grigory Mikulin does not understand the Scottish ambassador's question. He does not see the Tatars as conquerors of Russia, but rather as warriors in the service of the Russian Tsar. When medieval Western European chroniclers spoke about Russia, they wrote, "Such and such a Moscow sovereign went on with the Tatars on such and such a military campaign." Here is a quote from the book of the Habsburg ambassador to Russia, Baron Sigismund von Herberstein, Notes on Muscovite Affairs, written in the 16th century. In 1527, the Muscovites set out with the Tatars once more, resulting in the well-known Battle of Olshanitsa. This is a fragment from the German Chronicle of 1533. Here is what is said about Ivan the Terrible. Ivan Vasilievich, with his Tatars, took Kazan and Astrakhan into his kingdom. It turns out that, in the view of medieval Europeans, the Tatars were not conquerors, but warriors of the Russian Tsar. In 1252, the ambassador of King Louis IX of France, William of Rubruck, traveled with his retinue from Constantinople to the headquarters of Batu Khan, who wrote about this in his travel journal. Everywhere among the Tatars, the settlements of the Russians are scattered. The Russians mingled with the Tatars, adopted their customs, as well as their clothing and way of life. All forms of transportation in the vast country are serviced by the Russians. At the river crossings, the Russians are everywhere. It is noteworthy that Rubruck traveled across Russia only 15 years after the start of the Mongol-Tatar yoke. Didn't the Russians mix too quickly with the wild Mongols, adopting their clothes, customs, and way of life? Further, Rubruck wrote, "The wives of the Russians, similar to ours, wear jewelry on their heads and trim the hemlines of their dresses with stripes of ermine and other furs. Men wear short clothes, kaftans, chekmanis, and lambskin hats. Women adorn their heads with headdresses similar to those worn by French women. Men wear outerwear like German." Well, it turns out that the Mongol Tatar clothing in Russia in those days was no different from Western European outerwear. This drastically changes our understanding of the wild nomadic barbarians from the distant Mongolian steppes. Here is what the Arab chronicler and traveler, Ibn Battuta, wrote about the Golden Horde in his travel notes in 1333. There were many Russians in the Sarai of Berk. The majority of the armed, service and labor forces of the Golden Horde were Russian people.
Imagine all the absurdity of the described picture. For some reason, the victorious Mongols armed the Russian slaves they had defeated in battle, and these slaves make up the bulk of their troops, without offering armed resistance. Even in the history of ancient Rome, the victors did not arm the conquered slaves. On the contrary, the victors always disarm the vanquished. If they are later called up for military service, then they are a significant minority, since they are considered to be unreliable.
What turns out? Western European chroniclers who visited enslaved Russia idyllically depict Russian people walking around in Tatar costumes, which are not actually different from European ones. And the armed Russian warriors calmly serve the Khan's horde, without offering any resistance. It doesn't look very much like a yoke. Here is a miniature from the 14th century illustrated chronicle of Ivan the Terrible, depicting the battle between the Russians and the Tatars. It is impossible to distinguish Russians and Tatars here. Both have the same helmets, battle armor, sabers, shields, and the colors. However, on the head of one of the commanders, the Byzantine imperial crown is depicted for some reason, and the other has a Russian princely cap trimmed with fur. Can you say with certainty where the Russian squad is and where the Tatar horde is? No doubt, modern historians can explain this by attributing the ignorance of a medieval artist who painted this miniature not from life, but intuitively. However, it turns out that this artist was not the only one to display Russian and Tatar warriors in this way. On the miniatures of other medieval chroniclers depicting scenes of Russian-Tatar battles, including the famous The Tale of the Rout of Mamaye, Russians and Tatars are indistinguishable either. But in the miniatures depicting the scenes of the Battle of the Neva from the same illustrated chronicle of Ivan the Terrible, the Swedish dog knights differ from the Russian warriors in the rounded shape of their helmets. So, the artist's ignorance has no bearing on this. In addition, on all Russian medieval miniatures depicting Tatar raids, the Mongol Khans, for some reason, are depicted in royal crowns, and the chroniclers inexplicably don't call them Khans, but rather kings. Here is another miniature from the same illustrated chronicle of Ivan the Terrible, from the 14th century. It is called Batu's Invasion of Russian Cities. Batu Khan is fair-haired with Slavic features, he wears a crown, and his two armor-bearers are typical Zaporozhye Cossacks with top-knots on their shaved heads. The rest of the warriors of Batu Khan are no different from the Russian warriors. The exhibition of the Art Museum of the city of Yaroslavl showcases a large wooden icon from the 17th century depicting the life of Saint Sergius of Radanesh. At the bottom of the icon is the legendary Battle of Kulikovo between Russian Prince Dmitry Donskoy and Khan Mamaye. No one doubts the authenticity of this historical monument these days. However, Russians and Tatars are indistinguishable on this icon as well. Both sides wear the same gilded armor and helmets. Moreover, both Tatars and Russians fight under the same holy colors with an image of the holy Mandelion. Can you imagine the Tatar horde of Khan Mamaye fighting against the Russian warriors of Prince Dmitry Donskoy under the colors with the face of Jesus Christ? This is some nonsense, you might think. And yet it is a fact. It is unlikely that the Russian Church could afford such an oversight in the Orthodox icon. Here is what the medieval authors of the Annalistic Chronicles, Zadanshina, the region beyond the Don River, and the Tale of the Rout of Mamai, wrote about Mamai's army. And King Mamai came with 10 hordes and 70 princes. It can be seen that the Russian princes gave you a good beating. There are neither princes nor war boss with you. And immediately filthy Mamai fled, weeping, saying bitterly, "Brothers, we will not be in our own land and will no longer see our druzhina, squad, neither princes nor boyars. Why do you, filthy Mamai, desire the Russian land? In the end, the Zalesky horde has beaten you." And Mamai's princes, Yesa-Uls, Cossack captains, and boyars bowed to Toktamish. It turns out that according to the testimony of medieval chroniclers, the horde of Tsar Mamai was referred to as a druzhina, within which Yesa-Uls, princes, boyars, and warboss fought. And the army of Dmitry Donskoy was called the Zalesky horde. Here is another intriguing document. We learn about the composition of Batu Khan's army from the letter King Bela IV of Hungary wrote to the Pope of Rome in 1241. When Hungary was invaded by the Mongols, it was mostly turned into a desert and surrounded by various infidel tribes, such as Russians, Brodnichi from the east, Bulgarians, and other heretics from the south. Excuse me, but where are the Mongols actually here? However, it turns out that the troops of Batu Khan were mainly composed of Slavs, namely Russians, Brodnichi, and Bulgarians. Imagine the situation. There is not a single Mongol or Tatar in the horde of the legendary Mongol Batu Khan. What madness! This Western European miniature from an old handwritten book is, kind of, an illustration of the letter of the Hungarian king. It depicts the battle between the Mongols and the Hungarians on the bridge over the Shayo River. The Mongols look like medieval knights, armed with heavy swords and wearing tightly closed metal helmets. Who forged these battle swords and armor for them? Aren't Russians skilled gunsmiths? They could hardly make all this in their wild Mongolian steppes.
Imagine a horde of thousands moving from Mongolia to Europe through Russia and conquering. In order to supply this army, it is necessary a large quantity of metal. Metal is needed for weapons, including horseshoes. As before, so now in Mongolia there is no ore, no metal specialists.
It turns out that during the time of the so-called Mongol-Tatar invasion, the horde Khans in Russia were called Tsars, not Khans, and Yesa-Uls, princes, boyars, and warbosses served in those fighting druzhinas. And the famous Mongol-Tatar horde, with crooked scimitars, shields, and bows in their hands, terrifying with their sudden massive raids, wild screams and hoots. This is just a myth, a fairy tale, a fable. It is known that the vast Mongol Empire, during its 300-year existence, left behind practically no written sources in the original Mongolian language. Here is what Osip Mikhailovich Kovalevsky, a well-known Russian Orientalist and professor at Kazan University, wrote at the end of the 19th century in his monograph, History of the Mongols. From ancient Mongolian written sources, we know only the inscription on the stone from the time, purportedly, of Genghis Khan, recently explained by Schmidt, and letters from Persian kings Arghun and Oljuaitu to the French king, also explicated by Schmidt in a brochure published in St. Petersburg in 1824. Additionally, Europe has manuscripts written in Mongolian letters in the Tatar language, such as a translation of the Persian novel Bakhtiar Nama.
These letters remained uncertain for a long time, without a title.
Finally, some Orientalists decided to accept the name Turk Oriental, or Uyghur, for them.
Whoever pays attention to the Uyghurs of Turkestan will take them for Turks.
But weren't they a Mongol tribe in ancient times? And is this all that the huge Mongol Empire left behind? An inscription on a stone, a couple of letters, and a novel? Not much, and the novel is written in Tatar. Only the letters are Mongolian. And even these meager texts were, it turns out, deciphered by the same person, a certain Mr. Schmidt. For some reason, Turkestan Uyghurs are considered descendants of the Mongol conquerors, who were mistakenly thought to be Turks. Only historians know that these Turks once were Mongols. The Turks themselves do not realize this for some reason. It is known that the Mongol Khans shaped their decrees into so-called yarliks, letters of the Khans.
Judging by the annals, the Mongol Empire should have left us a legacy of a large number of its documents, Mongol yarliks written in Mongol. However, no such documents have survived. Only a few pieces were found, not in the state historical archives, but in the papers of Western European historians. At the same time, many yarliks written by the Crimean Khans remain. However, they are not written in Mongolian but in Russian, Tatar, and Italian. This contradicts the traditional history that is accepted today.
However, a large number of documents from that period written in Russian have been preserved.
Treaties of princes, last wills and testaments, and so on.
This means that Russian remained the state language in Russia during the Mongol-Tatar subjugation. From the time of the Golden Horde Khanate, neither Mongolian written documents nor material ones have been preserved. Here is what the famous Russian archaeologist, Vasily Vasilyevich Grigoriev, wrote about this issue in the 19th century in the scientific article, 4-Year Archaeological Searches in the Ruins of Sarai. The history of the Golden Horde Khanate is one of the most impoverished by time and circumstance. Not only did they destroy the most important written documents, they wiped out most of the traces of the Khanate from the face of the earth. Its once flourishing and populous cities lie in ruins. And about the capital of the Horde, the famous Sarai, we do not even know to what ruins its big name could be attributed. Then Grigoriev continued. It would seem that the most positive indications of the era of the foundation of Sarai should be expected from our chronicles.
But our chronicles in this case evilly deceive expectations. Speaking of the princes going to the Horde or to the court, they do not determine where the Horde was located.
In such cases, they simply articulate, go to the Horde, and come from the Horde, without indicating where exactly the Horde was. Lev Gumilyov also writes about this. Despite the fact that the problem of the creation and destruction of the power of Genghis Khan has concerned many historians, it has not yet been resolved.
The Mongols were surprised to learn that Genghis Khan had featured in their history. Genghis Khan is not a Mongolian name. They were surprised that Genghis Khan brought great wealth to the territory of Mongolia, including buried treasures. Naturally, Russian expeditions are looking for these treasures, and Mongols are as well, but they have yet to find them due to the fact that there was never a horde, nor Genghis Khan, and thus no treasures.
As can be seen, many questions arise regarding the history of the Mongol-Tatar conquest. Why, for example, did a great empire that was in existence for 300 years leave behind virtually no material monuments? Why did the Mongol Khans write their Yarlik decrees, that is, state documents, in Russian? Could it be that the conquerors of Russia were not the Mongols at all? In the 14th century, illustrated Chronicle of Ivan the Terrible, the chapter, The Tale of the Rout of Mamai, states, "By God's permission, for our sins, the Tsar of the eastern country, named Mamai and a Hellene by faith, has risen at the instigation of the devil." This is a rather unexpected message because Greeks, known as Hellenes, are Christians, as you know. Perhaps a scribe's mistake or a misunderstood word in the original source. Perhaps. However, it turns out that not only the Russian chronicles, but also many European chronicles unequivocally state that the Mongols were Christians. Modern historians often brush aside these testimonies, providing an explanation and often dismissing a discussion with medieval authors as being ignorant. However, many ancient documents testify that the Mongol Khans were Christian. For example, in the Annals of Burton Abbey from the late 13th century, there is an interesting entry. When asked about religion, the Tatar replied that they believe in the one Lord of the world. He said, God the Father and his Son are in heaven. Shere Khan, that is, Genghis Khan, on earth. But the Muslim God, Allah, has no son. Only Christians have Jesus, the Son of God. It turned out that the Tartar, who spoke with the minister of Burton Abbey in Burton-upon-Trent about his faith, was a Christian. Further, the same source informs. They say that their leader, Genghis Khan, is Saint John. It turns out that Genghis Khan, according to the testimony of the medieval Tatars, was also a Christian, since they called him Saint John. By the way, the name Genghis Khan means Great Khan. This is a title, not a name.
Until the 17th century in Russia, in addition to baptismal names, other nicknames were also bestowed. They were used both in everyday life and in official documents. Many of them would sound like Tatar to a modern person's ear. However, in the Middle Ages they were worn by typical Russians.
This is confirmed by the well-known research of the historian Yevgeny Petrovich Karnovich, Family Nicknames and Titles in Russia, 1886. There, in particular, the following is said about this. Baptismal names in Moscow were very often replaced not only by other Christian ones, but also by Tatar ones. For example, Bulat, Murat, Akhmat, so that, from such dummy names, semi-patronymics were made, which later turned into generic nicknames of people who were purely Russian in origin. You can learn about the names of the Horde Tatars before they were baptized using the example of the Verderevsky's genealogical book, which was published in 1686. It tells that in 1371, at the request of Oleg II Ivanovich, Grand Prince of Ryazan, the Tatar, Solokmir Miroslavov, came to him from the Grand Horde. This Solokmir was then baptized, and married the daughter of the Grand Prince, laying the foundation for the famous Russian boyar family, the Verderevskys. He got the baptismal name Ivan. Ivan Miroslavich, that was the name of the baptized Tatar, had a son Grigory. Grigory Ivanovich Solokmir had children, Grigory and Mihailo, nicknames Abu Milo, and Ivan, nicknamed Conche, and Constantine, nicknamed Divnoy.
It turns out that the unbaptized Tatar who had just arrived from the Grand Horde bore, as it turns out, the Slavic pagan name, Solokmir, Solohamir, and his father, also a Tatar, was called Miroslav, which means peace and glory, a Slavic name. After being baptized, Solokmir was given the name Ivan according to the calendar. However, baptismal names were not used in everyday life at that time, so he and his children, in addition to their baptismal names, also acquired nicknames. His children were given the nicknames Abu Milo, Conche, and Divnoy.
Among such nicknames, there were many that were perceived by ear as Tatar. For example, Mirza, Epancha, Saltir, Suleisha, Sumbur, Sunbul, Surian, Tashlik, Tamir, Kudiyar, and so on. In this regard, it can be assumed that the nickname Yermak, well known in Russia, derived from the baptismal name German. The name Batu is derived from the Russian word batya, which translates to father or dad. The same can be said about the name Mamai. Apparently, this is one of the forms of the Russian word for mother's son.
Remember, for example, the legendary Zaporozhian Cossack Slav named Mamai.
So, we have learned that the Western European chroniclers unequivocally tell us about the Christian Tatars and their leader Genghis Khan as Saint John. The name, Genghis Khan, itself turns out to not be a name at all. This is the title of the great Khan, and Christian names given at baptism in Russia were almost never used in everyday life. Russians in those days had nicknames, sometimes even Tatar or similar to Tatar, so foreigners mistook them for Tatars.
What kind of relationship did the Russian Orthodox Church have with the Horde during the so-called Mongol-Tatar yoke?
It is known that the Church has always called on its congregants to fight against foreign invaders. But during the time of the Mongol-Tatar slavery, no calls were made from the Orthodox Church to the oppressed Russian people. Moreover, from the very first days of the enslavement of Russia, the Church provided all kinds of support to the pagan Mongols. Historians may object, saying that the Church in those days was corrupt, caving in and groveling before the conquerors, like all Russian princes and the entire Russian people. However, was it truly so? Here is what Russian historians wrote about this in the 19th century. During the Tatar-Mongol invasion, an Orthodox Church was built at the headquarters of the Khan from the beginning of the formation of the Golden Horde. As military settlements were established in the Horde, Orthodox churches were erected, clergy were called in, and church hierarchies were established. Metropolitan Kirill moved from Novgorod to Kiev, where he restored the metropolia of all Russia. The Metropolitan enjoyed significant benefits from the Mongol authorities. His power was extensive in comparison with the princely.
Karamzin writes about this in his History of the Russian State.
One of the consequences of Tatar domination was the rise of our clergy, an increase in the number of monks, and the expansion of church estates. The possessions of the church, freed from horde and princely taxes, prospered. Few of today's Russian monasteries were founded before or after the Tatars. All the others have remained an exemplum to that time. It turns out that almost all Orthodox Russian monasteries were founded during the Mongol-Tatar yoke. Incredible! It is hard to believe, as historians tell us today, that churches and monasteries in Russia were plundered, defiled, and destroyed by the Tatars. Near Bakhchisarai, the capital of the medieval Crimean Khanate, the Orthodox Assumption Monastery was built in the early 15th century. After the capture of the Crimea by the Turks in 1475, this monastery became the residence of the Metropolitan, the center of orthodoxy in the region. Here is what the Russian historian of the 17th century, Andrei Ivanovich Lizlov, wrote about this in his book, Scythian History, dedicated to the history of the Kazan Kingdom and the Ottoman Empire. Once upon a time, the Khan of the Crimea, Haja Garay, fighting against his adversaries, asked for help from the Most Holy Lady Theotokos in the Assumption Monastery, promising a famous offering and honoring her image. And he did so when he returned with profit and victory. After selecting a couple of the best horses, he sold them and purchased wax and candles, enough to last a full year. Even his heirs, the Crimean Khans, did so on many occasions.
Incredible. A Muslim is asking for help from the Orthodox Mother of God.
These Mongols are strange conquerors. Instead of destroying and plundering churches and monasteries, as historians claim, they, on the contrary, encouraged their mass construction and entrusted Orthodox Church authorities with significant privileges.
And, for some reason, they honor the image of the Christian icon of the Mother of God.
He lit candles in front of her and, praying, ordered his heirs to do the same. Exploring the cultural heritage of the Russian Middle Ages, it is impossible not to pay attention to some oddities from a modern historical perspective in the handwritten text of the famous literary monument of Afanasy Nikitin, A Journey Beyond the Three Seas. This manuscript begins with the words, "In return for the prayer of our Holy Fathers, O Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on your sinful slave Afanasy, son of Nikita." It is clear that this text was written by an Orthodox person. Basically, the journey is written in Russian. However, from time to time, Afanasy Nikitin freely and seamlessly switches to Turkic or even Arabic, and then just as seamlessly returns to Russian. Obviously, he, like his fellow countrymen, was fluent in these languages. That, however, is not the point. The main thing is that Afanasy Nikitin used the Turkic or Arabic language to write Russian Orthodox prayers, or, if you like, Islamic Orthodox prayers, no matter how strange it may sound in our time. Here, for example, "Do not turn me away, Lord, from the true path and guide me, Lord, on your right path. My Lord,
Allah, Перводитель Allah, Ты Карим Allah, Рагим Allah, Карим Allah, Рагим Allah, Ахалим Дулиммо."
I have already passed 4 Easters in the Muslim land, but I have not forsaken Christianity. Here, Afanasy Nikitin, right in the middle of his prayer, switches to Turkic and Arabic, but writes them down using Russian letters. In particular, instead of God, he writes Olo, that is, Allah, and so on. Afanasy Nikitin ended his manuscript with the following words: "By the grace of God, the 3 seas have passed."
Дигерь худо дано Allah, перевод дигерь дано, аминь. Милна рахмам радим Allah, агабдирь. Акши ходо илейло, акш ходо, иса рою холло, айлик солом Allah, агабдирь. Гир.
Oh, help thy slave. Here, Afanasy Nikitin uses expressions from the Quran such as Olo Akbar, Allahu Akbar, and Isa Ruhallah, which translates to Jesus, the Spirit of Allah. He does not view this as blasphemy, but as an acceptable norm. Probably today we do not know something very important about medieval Christianity in Russia. Let us open the foundational publication, the State Kremlin Armory, which contains photographs and descriptions of valuable items stored in the Kremlin Armory. Here is the ceremonial damask helmet of the Moscow Tsars, commonly known as the Jericho cap. The helmet is adorned with precious stones, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. It is known that the Jericho cap was made in 1621 by Russian craftsman Nikita Davidov, who was the chief craftsman of the Moscow Kremlin Armory.
One of the most famous items in the Kremlin Armory is the Jericho cap, a military helmet attributed to Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. This is a luxurious helmet with typical Orthodox symbols, including the image of the royal crown, the Orthodox cross, and the Archangel Michael. At the same time, this helmet depicts an Arabic inscription, which means, "and please the believers," an expression from the Quran. At our request, this inscription was translated by Chernenko, a specialist in Arabic.
Russian craftsman Nikita Davidov placed a royal crown and an 8-pointed Orthodox cross, along with Arabic sayings from the Koran, on the Jericho cap. There are no Russian inscriptions on this helmet, which is intended for the Tsar of the Russian Orthodox Church. It turns out that the use of the Tatar Turkic language alongside Russian in everyday life was considered the norm in medieval Russia. The people of Russia at that time also knew the Arabic language. That is why the Arabic script was often used as an ornamental decoration on combat armor and edged weapons. It is interesting to see how the Mongol-Tatar yoke has influenced Russian culture and, in particular, the Russian language. After all, the horde of wild barbarians that flooded medieval Russia hopelessly corrupted and trampled the primordially Russian language into the mud, plunging the enslaved people into darkness, ignorance, and illiteracy. Cities, Orthodox churches, monastic libraries, ancient books are burning, treasures are being robbed, and things like that. Historians are convinced that the Mongol-Tatar yoke prevented the development of culture in Russia for 3 centuries, turning the Russian people into ignorant semi-savages. However, for some reason, Karamzin wrote differently about this time. Our language from the 13th to the 15th century acquired more purity and correctness. Instead of the uneducated Russian dialect, the writers carefully adhered to the grammar of church books or ancient Serbian, not only in declensions and conjugations, but also in pronunciation. So paradoxically, we must admit that the Mongol-Tatar yoke in Russia became an era of blossoming Russian culture.
The Englishman Jerome Horsey, head of the Moscow office of the Russian Company of English Merchants, wrote in the 16th century, Slavic, that is, the Russian language can also be useful in Turkey, Persia, and even in the now known parts of India.
It appears that in the 16th century, part of the population of Turkey, Persia, and India spoke Russian. It is known that many books and official documents of the imperial administration in Western Europe were written and printed in Russian Church Slavonic as early as the 16th century. It is likely that the language of international communication there at that time was Russian. For example, in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, it was not until the 17th century that Latin became the international language in the West. However, historians continue to tell us today that medieval Russia was a wild, backward, impoverished, and ignorant country. Forests and swamps, waist-deep snow, bears on the streets and men in bast shoes and ear flaps, always drunk and rowdy. And if anything good happened in Russia, it was only thanks to Europe, which has been progressive, rich, and civilized since ancient times. But the Russian historian and researcher, the oldest curator of the Hermitage, Ivan Georgievich Spassky, in his monograph, Russian Yefimki, says something completely different. He informs us that Western European silver flowed into Russia until the 17th century. Russia was inundated with silver and gold, since it had no gold or silver mines of its own at the time. Part of the silver imported annually was used in jewelry production, and found its way into the decoration of Russian churches, the royal treasury, and the homes of the wealthy. The sheer abundance of buried coin treasures found on the territory of Russia is incomprehensible. Only during the medieval period in Russia were the Golden Gates cast in Vladimir and Kiev. Only in Russia were the domes of churches and roofs covered with gold, not only in the capital but also in provincial cities. The abundance of gold in Russia up until the 17th century, according to Karamzin, confirms the remarkable prosperity of the Russian princes during the Tatar-Mongol yoke. This map, made in Paris in 1670, is called the Great Tartary. According to the map, the territory of the Great Tartary included not only the Russian Empire, but also Western Europe, India, Iran, China, Japan and America. This map suggests that the Great Tartary was once a huge, powerful, centralized state.
In many provinces of the Mongol Empire, local governors were in charge, assigned by the Khan, who ruled from the capital city of the empire in Russia Horde. All of these governors were vassals of this emperor. In those years, there was only one emperor in the empire. The word emperor was exclusively applied to the Tsar Khan of the metropolis of Russia Horde and the Great Mongol Empire.
The nobility and aristocracy of Western Europe in those days largely consisted of the conquerors, that is, natives of Russia, who arrived in the 13th to 14th centuries. Even in the 17th century, it was still well remembered that many lands in Germany not long before had been densely populated by Slavs. The same applied to England, Italy, Spain, Greece, and some other European countries that were part of the Russia Horde Empire. This is why Europe trembled, frightened by the invasion of the Mongol hordes. Now, we understand who these Mongols were and why today the West, and not only the West, do not want to remember this. The rulers of the countries that emerged on the territory of the former Great Tartary did all they could to forget the servitude of the earlier period. They fabricated their genealogies, pretending to be descendants of ancient civilizations, and designated medieval Russia as a dense wilderness. From everything that is depicted in this film, one can draw a logical conclusion. There has never been any Mongol-Tatar yoke in Russia. There was a specific period of internal process during the unification of the Russian lands and the strengthening of the Tsar Khan power in the country. The entire population of Russia was divided into civilians, ruled by princes, and a permanent regular army called the Horde, under the command of voivodes, military governors, who could be of Russian, Tatar, Turkish, or other nationalities. At the head of the army horde was the Tsar or Khan. He held supreme power in the country.
The Testament of Ivan Kalatay states, for example, "Not knowing what the Almighty has for me in the horde where I am going to, I leave this last will. I order, in the case of my death, that the city of Moscow should go to my sons." The meaning of this statement is clear to everyone. Going to the army horde, Ivan Kalatay leaves a will for his children in case of his death in battle. Writing such testaments in Russia was then a common practice. The remnants of the Russian army horde have survived to this day. These are the legendary Cossack troops. Back in the 17th century, they were widespread throughout Russia.
Russian warriors Cossacks, having served their term in the Cossack army, retired for a well-earned rest. For this, many monasteries were created in the Mongol Empire. Monasteries served as centers of learning, culture, and most importantly, they were tax-exempt, which shows their special status in the empire.
Now we already know that in Russia, the words Tatars and Cossacks meant, in essence, the same thing. Therefore, Mamai brought to the Kulikovo field not a multi-tribal Mongol-Tatar horde, but Russian Cossack regiments. The Battle of Kulikovo likely was an internal war. It is known that Russia paid tribute to the horde, a tenth of their property and a tenth of their population. Today, it is considered, in particular, evidence of the Mongol-Tatar yoke. However, we are talking here about the tax that existed in Russia at that time for the maintenance of the hoarded army, as well as the conscription of young people into the army.
In those days, recruits were recruited into the army horde at a young age.
The recruited Cossack warriors never come back home. This military conscription was the same tagma, a tribute of blood that the Russians allegedly paid to the Tatars.
For refusing to pay tribute, the military administration of the Horde punished the population in the offending areas with punitive expeditions.
These actions are presented by historians today as supposedly Tatar raids on Russian territories. Naturally, such pacification operations were accompanied by bloody excesses, violence, and executions. Gumilyov rightly believed that the theory of the Mongol-Tatar yoke in Russia was created only in the 18th century by German historians, such as Bayer, Miller, and Schlosser, in response to a certain social order under the influence of ideas about the supposedly slave origin of the Russian people. This theory gave rise to a blatant fabrication regarding the bloody confrontation in Russia between the Tatars and Russians, depicting some as conquerors and others as oppressed. This is how Russian history was falsified.
In fact, medieval Mongolia, or Mogolia, was a multi-nation state spread over vast expanses of Eurasia. No foreign power has ever conquered it. It was originally inhabited by peoples who had always lived on their own land, Russians, Tatars, and others. The very word, Mongolia, most likely comes from the Russian, Mnogo, Mogu, meaning, a lot, I can, or, perhaps, as Morozov believed, from the Greek word, megalion, meaning, great. In Russian historical sources, the word, Mongolia, is not used, but Great Russia is found. Foreigners referred to Great Russia as Mongolia, or, the Great One.
So, we already know that there was never any Mongol-Tatar yoke in Russia.
The misconceptions of modern historians about this are erroneous, and potentially deliberate.
As, however, determining the date of Christ's birth, from which current chronology is conducted, as you know. When Jesus was born and when he was crucified, we will address these in our next film. In what century did Christ live?
Христос.